a crime boss with an unforgivable past. Alessandra Ricci had spent years playing the perfect mafia daughter. Quiet, beautiful, obedient. But when she was kidnapped and thrown into a rival family's war, she learned something dangerous. She was worth more as a hostage than she had ever been as a princess. Her captor, Dario Luciano, stepped forward, tilting her chin up between rough fingers. "You're not leaving here," he murmured, his voice smooth, dark. "Not until your father decides how much you're worth." Chapter 1. The gilded cage shatters. The chandelier, a cascade of Venetian glass and shimmering light, cast a warm glow over the Ricci family dining room. Alessandra Ricci sat poised, a delicate porcelain doll in a silk dress the color of aged ivory. Her hands, slender and graceful, rested lightly on the linen tablecloth, the only outward sign of the turmoil brewing within. Outside, the Roman night was a velvet cloak, punctuated by the distant wail of sirens, a constant, almost comforting reminder of the world her family controlled and the world she was perpetually shielded from. Her father, Don Antonio Ricci, a man whose presence filled the room like a gathering storm, held court at the head of the table. His voice, a low rumble that demanded attention, sliced through the polite chatter of family and associates. He was discussing business, the kind of business that involved coded phrases and veiled threats, the kind of business that had built their empire on a foundation of fear and respect. Alessandra had learned to tune it out, to focus instead on the intricate patterns of the silverware, the delicate aroma of the osso buco, the practiced smile that hid the growing chasm between her outward appearance and her inner self. She was 57, yet felt both older and younger. Older in the weight of responsibility she carried, the weight of being a Ricci woman, bound by tradition and expectation. Younger in the naive hope that still flickered within her, a hope that whispered of a life beyond the gilded cage. Her marriage, arranged decades ago to solidify an alliance with another powerful family, had been dutiful. Her husband, Marco, was a man of ambition and cold calculation, a man who saw her as an asset, not a woman. He was absent tonight, as he often was, tending to matters that Alessandra was never privy to. She didn't mourn his absence. She barely registered it. Across the table, her younger brother, Leo, caught her eye. He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. Leo, the heir apparent, carried the burden of their father's expectations with a swaggering confidence that Alessandra envied. He was the golden son, the future of the Ricci family. She was the ornament, the silent observer. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the dining room burst open, shattering the illusion of serene control. Armed men, their faces masked, stormed in, the polished gleam of their weapons reflecting the chandelier's light in a terrifying dance. Panic erupted. Screams mingled with the crash of overturned chairs and shattering china. Don Antonio, for the first time Alessandra could remember, looked genuinely surprised, his eyes wide with a flicker of something that might have been fear.
"Get down!"
Leo roared, his voice laced with a primal urgency that cut through the chaos. He shoved Alessandra under the table, shielding her with his body. The linen tablecloth, once pristine, was now stained with spilled wine and the splatters of something darker, something that smelled metallic and terrifying. Alessandra squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could hear the brutal efficiency of the attack, the clipped commands in a dialect she didn't recognize, the desperate pleas of her family. Then, a rough hand grabbed her arm, yanking her from beneath the table. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the surrounding pandemonium. She was dragged through the dining room, past the overturned tables and the bodies sprawled on the floor, past the shattered remnants of her carefully constructed life. She saw Leo, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered lion, but he was outnumbered, overwhelmed. Her father was nowhere to be seen. Outside, the cool night air hit her face like a slap. She was shoved into the back of a waiting van, the doors slamming shut with a resounding clang that echoed the finality of her situation. The van sped off, leaving behind the shattered remnants of her gilded cage, leaving behind everything she had ever known. As the city lights blurred into streaks of color, Alessandra felt a strange sense of liberation. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a sense of awakening. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone, stripped bare of the Ricci name and the expectations that had suffocated her for so long. She was a hostage, yes, but she was also free. In the deafening silence of the speeding van, a singular thought cut across the terror. What price would her father place on the ornamental daughter? Would he even pay it? The thought, stark and brutal, left a chilling emptiness where fear had once resided. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Luciano Estate. The van ride was a blur of darkness and jarring motion. Alessandra had lost all track of time, her mind a whirlwind of fear and a strange, nascent sense of anticipation. She had no idea where they were taking her, only that it was far away from the familiar streets of Rome, far away from the life she had known. When the van finally screeched to a halt, the doors were flung open and she was roughly pulled out into the cold night air. She stumbled, her legs stiff from the cramped journey, and nearly fell. A strong hand caught her arm, steadying her. She looked up, her eyes meeting the gaze of one of her captors. He was a young man, barely more than a boy, with a hardened face that belied his age. He said nothing, his expression unreadable. Alessandra found herself standing before a massive iron gate, its intricate design silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Beyond the gate, a long, winding driveway led to a sprawling estate, shrouded in shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the perfumed gardens of her family home. This place felt ancient, powerful, and utterly unfamiliar. She was led through the gate and up the driveway, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The estate loomed before her, a hulking silhouette against the lightening sky. It was a villa, centuries old, with walls of weathered stone and tall, arched windows that seemed to watch her with a silent, knowing gaze. This was Luciano territory, a name spoken in hushed whispers within the Ricci household, a name synonymous with rivalry, with power, with danger. The front door, a massive slab of dark wood, opened with a groan, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, filled with antique furniture, heavy tapestries, and portraits of stern-faced men and women who seemed to stare down at her with disapproval. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and something else, something indefinable, a hint of danger that sent a shiver down her spine. She was taken to a room on the upper floor, a large, sparsely furnished chamber with a high, vaulted ceiling and a single, barred window that overlooked a neglected garden. The room was cold, despite the presence of a large fireplace, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. "You'll stay here," the young man who had been guarding her said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Do not attempt to leave. You will be watched." He left, locking the door behind him with a heavy click that echoed through the room. Alessandra stood in the center of the chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone, truly alone, in the heart of enemy territory. She walked to the window, her hands gripping the cold iron bars. The garden below was a tangle of overgrown weeds and neglected rose bushes, a mirror of the wild, untamed nature of this place. She could see the faint outline of the surrounding hills, shrouded in mist, and the distant lights of a small town. She was a prisoner, yes, but she was also removed, separated from the suffocating expectations, the suffocating protection of her former life. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Alessandra felt a tear roll down her cheek. It was not a tear of fear, not entirely. It was a tear of release. A tear for the life she had lost, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. She was in the shadows now, in the heart of the Luciano estate, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The silence of the room was no longer oppressive. It was a space to consider, a space to simply be, rather than perform. The echo of the locked door was still a fresh, harsh sound. But with the lock, a sense of quiet had also been delivered. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark Hallways. The first few days at the Luciano estate were a blur of fear and disorientation. Alessandra remained confined to her room, her meals brought to her by a silent, elderly woman who refused to meet her eyes. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards in the hallway outside, the distant sound of voices, and the ever-present whisper of the wind. She spent hours pacing the room, her mind racing, trying to make sense of her situation. She tried to recall everything she had ever heard about the Luciano family, the whispers of their ruthlessness, their power, their long-standing feud with the Riccis. She knew that her kidnapping was a strategic move, a pawn in a deadly game of power and control. But what was her role in this game? What did they want from her? The uncertainty was the worst part. The not knowing. She imagined her father receiving the ransom demand, his face contorted with rage, and perhaps a flicker of concern. She tried to picture her husband, Marco, his reaction to her abduction. Would he see it as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority? Or would he simply see it as another business transaction, a cost to be calculated and negotiated? She found herself thinking about Leo, her brother, the only person in her family who had ever truly seen her, understood her. She wondered if he was searching for her, if he was consumed by the same fear and uncertainty that gnawed at her. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, she heard a soft knock on the door. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The elderly woman who brought her meals never knocked. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. There was a pause, then a man's voice, low and smooth, replied, "It is Dario. Dario Luciano." The name sent a jolt of fear through her. Dario Luciano, the son of Don Giovanni Luciano, the head of the family, the man who had orchestrated her kidnapping. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She knew she shouldn't open the door, that it was dangerous, foolish. But something compelled her, a curiosity that outweighed her fear. She opened the door. He stood in the hallway, bathed in the soft glow of a nearby lamp. He was taller than she had expected, with a lean, muscular build and a presence that radiated power and control. His eyes, a dark, intense brown, seemed to see right through her. He was dressed impeccably, in a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and narrow waist. He had a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, lending a dangerous edge to his otherwise handsome features. "Signora Ricci," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "I apologize for the inconvenience." His words were polite, almost formal, but his eyes held a hint of something else, something that made her skin prickle with unease. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wanted to see you. To see the woman who has caused such a stir in our respective families." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. She could smell his cologne, a subtle blend of citrus and spice, a scent that was both alluring and unsettling. "You are more beautiful than the report suggested," he said, his voice a husky whisper. Alessandra felt a flush creep up her neck. She was not accustomed to such directness, such blatant appraisal. She had spent her life being admired from afar, treated as a precious object, not as a woman. "I am a hostage," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "Not a spectacle." His smile widened. "Indeed. But even hostages can be intriguing." He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her cheek. She flinched, but didn't pull away. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the rough treatment she had received from his men. "Don't be afraid, Signora Ricci," he said, his voice softening. "I won't hurt you. Not unless your father forces my hand." The threat was veiled, but it was there, hanging in the air between them. He was playing with her, testing her, trying to gauge her reaction. "My father will pay the ransom, she said, her voice stronger now. He will not abandon me. She hoped her show of confidence was enough. She wasn't certain what her father would do. Dario Luciano studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he nodded slowly. Perhaps. But in the meantime you are mine. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her ear. And I intend to make the most of our time together. He gave her a small, knowing smile before turning and walking away, leaving Alessandra trembling in the doorway, her mind reeling from the encounter. The whispers of the old house seemed to echo his last words, a promise and a threat intertwined. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty and Blood. The following days settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Dario Luciano visited Alessandra every evening, sometimes bringing her small gifts, a book of poetry, a piece of fruit, a single, perfect rose. He would talk to her, asking her about her life, her interests, her dreams. He seemed genuinely interested in her, in a way that no one, not even her own family, had ever been. His conversations were a carefully constructed dance, a blend of charm and veiled threats. He would speak of his family, his upbringing, the weight of responsibility he carried as the heir to the Luciano Empire. He would talk about the feud between their families, the decades of bloodshed and betrayal, the endless cycle of violence. He painted a picture of a world governed by loyalty and honor, a world where blood was thicker than water, where debts were paid in full, no matter the cost. Alessandra listened, captivated and repelled in equal measure. She found herself drawn to his charisma, his intelligence, his underlying vulnerability. He was a dangerous man, a criminal, a captor. But he was also human. He had a past filled with loss and pain, a past that had shaped him into the man he was. He told her about his mother, a woman of great beauty and strength, who had died when he was young. He spoke of his father, a man hardened by years of war and betrayal, a man who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience. He revealed the pressures he faced, the expectations he had to live up to, the constant threat of violence that hung over his head. Alessandra, in turn, began to share her own stories, her own frustrations. She spoke of her gilded cage, her arranged marriage, her longing for a life beyond the suffocating confines of her family's expectations. She confessed her fears, her doubts, her secret dreams. She found herself opening up to him in a way she had never opened up to anyone before. It was a dangerous game. She knew, to confide in her captor, to reveal her vulnerabilities. But she couldn't help herself. There was something about him, something about the way he listened, the way he looked at her, that made her feel seen. One evening, he brought her a small, antique music box. It was made of intricately carved wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. When he opened it, a delicate melody filled the room, a haunting tune that spoke of lost love and longing. "My mother used to play this for me," he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. She said it was a song about hope, about finding beauty even in the darkest of times. Alessandra looked at him, her heart aching with a strange mixture of sadness and something else. Something she couldn't quite name. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He closed the music box, the melody fading into silence. He looked at her, his eyes intense, searching. "You are beautiful, Alessandra," he said, his voice husky. "You are like a flower blooming in the darkness." He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. She didn't flinch this time. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. She felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. A feeling of desire. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a question more than a demand. She responded, hesitantly at first, then with increasing passion. The kiss deepened, a whirlwind of forbidden emotions, a collision of fear and desire, of restraint and surrender. Suddenly, a sharp noise from the hallway outside broke the spell. Dario pulled away, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something else. Something that looked like fear. "I must go," he said, his voice strained. "But I will return." He left, leaving Alessandra trembling in the aftermath of the kiss, her mind a chaotic jumble of emotions. She had crossed a line, a dangerous, irreversible line. She had kissed her captor, the enemy of her family, and she had wanted it. The price of that kiss, she knew, could be very high indeed. The whispers in the hallway seemed to mock her now, a chorus of impending doom. Chapter 5. A dance of defiance and desire. The kiss changed everything. It hung in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the forbidden attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface. Dario's visits became more charged, more intense, filled with a palpable tension that both thrilled and terrified Alessandra. He continued to bring her gifts, small tokens of his affection. A silk scarf, a bottle of her favorite perfume, a collection of rare books. Each gift was a carefully chosen gesture, a way of communicating his desire without words. He was courting her in his own way, a courtship conducted in the shadows, under the constant threat of discovery. Alessandra found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was still a hostage, still a pawn in a deadly game. But she was also a woman who had been starved of affection, of attention, of genuine connection. And Dario, despite his dangerous nature, despite the circumstances of their meeting, was offering her all of those things. She began to look forward to his visits, her heart beating faster whenever she heard his footsteps in the hallway. She found herself dressing with more care, choosing clothes that flattered her figure, applying a touch of makeup, a hint of perfume. She was playing a dangerous game, she knew, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. One evening, he arrived with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He poured them each a glass, the ruby liquid gleaming in the soft lamplight. To us, he said, raising his glass. To this unusual situation. Alessandra hesitated, then raised her own glass. To us, she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. They drank in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable. Dario set down his glass and reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her. Alessandra, he said, his voice low and husky. I know this is wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help myself. I am drawn to you, like a moth to a flame. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the desire in his gaze, but she also saw something else. A vulnerability, a loneliness that mirrored her own. I feel it too, she confessed, her voice trembling. I know I shouldn't. But he leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. This time, the kiss was not tentative. It was passionate, demanding, a release of all the pent-up emotions that had been building between them. She responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. They were lost in a world of their own, a world where the rules didn't apply, where the past and the future didn't matter. Only the present, only the overwhelming need for connection, for intimacy, remained. Suddenly, a loud banging on the door shattered the moment. They sprang apart, their hearts pounding, their faces flushed. Dario, are you in there? A voice called from the hallway. It was one of Dario's men, his tone urgent, almost panicked. Dario swore under his breath. I must go, he said, his voice strained. Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone. He left, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Alessandra stood there, trembling, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their kiss. She was playing with fire, she knew, and she was about to get burned. The banging continued, more insistent now, and she heard raised voices in the hall. The fragile world she and Dario had created for a few stolen moments had just come crashing down. Chapter 6. Scars beneath the surface. The commotion outside Alessandra's room continued for what felt like an eternity. She could hear shouting, the sound of running footsteps, and the occasional crash of something breaking. Fear gnawed at her, a cold knot in her stomach. What was happening? Had their forbidden liaison been discovered? Finally, the noise subsided, replaced by an unsettling silence. Alessandra waited, her heart pounding, her ears straining for any sound. After a long while, she heard a soft knock on the door. "Alessandra?" "It's me, Dario." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She was afraid, but she also needed to know what was happening. She opened the door. Dario stood in the hallway, his face pale, his expression grim. He had a cut on his cheek, and his clothes were disheveled. He looked defeated. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He leaned against the door, his shoulders slumped. "My father, he knows," he said, his voice heavy with despair. "He knows about us." Alessandra felt a chill run down her spine. She had known this was a possibility, but she had foolishly allowed herself to hope that they could keep their secret hidden.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dario ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "One of my men, he saw us. He reported it to my father." What will he do?" Dario looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "I don't know. He's unpredictable. He could order me to end this, to send you back." Or he didn't finish the sentence, but Alessandra understood. He could order her killed. The thought sent a wave of terror through her. "I am sorry," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I never wanted this to happen." Dario reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His touch was gentle, comforting. "It's not your fault, Alessandra," he said. It's my fault. I was reckless. I let my feelings cloud my judgment." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I won't let him hurt you," he said, his voice firm, determined. "I swear it. I will protect you, no matter the cost." His words gave her a flicker of hope, a small spark of warmth in the darkness. But she knew that his promise might not be enough. His father was a powerful man, a ruthless man, and he would not tolerate disobedience, especially not from his own son. Dario pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She clung to him, her body trembling. She could feel his heart beating against hers, a steady rhythm in the midst of the chaos. I care for you, Alessandra," he whispered, his voice husky. "More than I should. More than I ever thought possible." She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the truth in his gaze, the genuine affection that he felt for her. And she knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that she felt the same way about him. "I care for you too, Dario," she confessed, her voice barely audible. He kissed her then, a kiss filled with desperation and longing, a kiss that sealed their fate. They were bound together now, by a forbidden love, a love that could destroy them both. But in that moment, in the midst of the danger and uncertainty, it was the only thing that mattered. The scars of their pasts, both visible and hidden, seemed to meld in that embrace, a shared vulnerability that transcended their family's feud. The silence of the room was heavy, laden with the weight of their unspoken fears, and the even heavier weight of their unspoken promises. Chapter 7. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The next few days were a tense waiting game. Dario was summoned to see his father, leaving Alessandra alone in her room, consumed by anxiety and fear. She paced restlessly, replaying their last conversation in her mind, clinging to his promise to protect her. The elderly woman who brought her meals, Rosa, seemed to sense her distress. She still didn't speak, but she left a small, comforting gesture each day: a sprig of lavender on her pillow, a cup of chamomile tea, a warm shawl. These small acts of kindness were a lifeline, a reminder that she was not completely alone in this hostile environment. One afternoon, while exploring the limited confines of her room, Alessandra discovered a hidden compartment in the back of an old armoire. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant and feminine, and the letters were dated many years ago. Curiosity overcoming her caution, Alessandra began to read. The letters were written by a woman named Isabella, and they were addressed to a man named Giovanni. As she read, Alessandra realized with a jolt that she was reading the love letters of Dario's mother, Isabella, to his father, Giovanni Luciano, before they were married. The letters painted a vivid picture of a passionate, forbidden love, a love that had defied family expectations and societal norms. Isabella was from a rival family, a family that had been locked in a bitter feud with the Lucianos for generations. Their love was a dangerous secret, a betrayal of their family's loyalties. Alessandra was captivated by Isabella's story. She saw parallels between their situations, a shared experience of forbidden love, of defying family expectations. She read about Isabella's fears, her doubts, her unwavering determination to be with the man she loved. She also discovered a darker secret. Isabella's family had not only opposed the relationship, they had actively tried to sabotage it. They had spread lies, threatened Giovanni, and even attempted to arrange Isabella's marriage to another man. Sound familiar to Alessandra? But Isabella and Giovanni had persevered. They had fought for their love, against all odds. And they had eventually won. They had married, and they had had a son, Dario. The letters ended abruptly, shortly after Dario's birth. Alessandra knew that Isabella had died young, but the letters gave no indication of how. There was a sense of unfinished business, a lingering sadness that hung over the final pages. The discovery of the letters gave Alessandra a new perspective on her situation. She saw that she was not alone in her struggle, that others had faced similar challenges and had overcome them. She felt a connection to Isabella, a kinship that transcended time and circumstance. When Dario finally returned, he found Alessandra sitting by the window, the letters clutched in her hands. He looked exhausted, his face etched with worry. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice guarded. Alessandra showed him the letters. He recognized them instantly, his eyes widening in surprise. "My mother's letters," he said, his voice filled with emotion. I haven't seen these in years." He sat down beside her, and they read the letters together, their shoulders touching. Alessandra shared her insights, her understanding of Isabella's story. Dario listened, his expression softening. "She was a strong woman, my mother," he said, his voice filled with pride. "She taught me that love is worth fighting for, no matter the cost." He looked at Alessandra, his eyes searching hers. I understand now," he said. "I understand why you were drawn to these letters. We are living a similar story." He reached out, his hand taking hers. "I will not let history repeat itself, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm, determined. "I will not let our families tear us apart. I will fight for you, for us, just like my mother fought for my father." The letters had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that love could conquer even the deepest of divisions. The echoes of Isabella's past resonated with Alessandra's present, giving her strength and courage to face the uncertain future. The silence in the room was not empty, but was filled with a shared history, a shared hope, and a shared love. Chapter 8. The Weight of Unspoken Words. After revealing his mother's letters, a fragile understanding settled between Dario and Alessandra. The shared history, the echoes of a love that had defied similar odds, created a bond that transcended their current circumstances. However, the weight of the unspoken still hung heavy in the air. Dario's father, Don Giovanni, remained an ominous, unseen presence, a constant threat looming over their fragile connection. Dario visited Alessandra as often as he could, snatching moments away from the watchful eyes of his family. He was careful, cautious, but his desire to be with her was evident in every glance, every touch, every stolen kiss. He spoke less of his family, less of the business, and more of his hopes, his dreams, his fears. He revealed a vulnerability that he had never shown anyone before, a vulnerability that drew Alessandra even closer to him. One evening, he brought her a small, silver locket. Inside, there was a miniature portrait of his mother, Isabella. "I want you to have this," he said, his voice husky. "A reminder of what we are fighting for." Alessandra accepted the locket, her fingers tracing the delicate features of the woman who had become a symbol of hope and resilience. She fastened it around her neck, the cool metal a constant reminder of Dario's love and his promise. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. It's beautiful. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear. You are beautiful, Alessandra, he whispered back. More beautiful than you know. They spent the evening talking, sharing stories, laughing softly. They were creating their own world, a world within the walls of the Luciano estate, a world where the feud between their families didn't exist. But the reality of their situation was never far away. One night, Dario arrived looking particularly troubled. He paced restlessly, his hands clenched into fists. What is it? Alessandra asked, her heart filled with a sense of foreboding. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. My father, he has received a counter-offer, he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Alessandra's blood ran cold. A counter-offer? From whom? From Marco, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Your husband. The word husband felt like a slap in the face. Alessandra had almost forgotten about Marco, about her arranged marriage, about the life she had left behind. What does he want? She asked, her voice trembling. Dario turned away, his shoulders slumping. He wants more than my father is willing to give. He wants control of certain territories. He wants to humiliate my father. To break him. Alessandra understood. Marco was using her as a pawn, not to get her back, but to advance his own ambitions. He was leveraging her captivity to gain an advantage over the Lucianos. She was nothing more than a bargaining chip in his ruthless quest for power. And what will your father do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dario turned back to her, his eyes filled with a chilling determination. He will refuse. He will not be bullied. He will not give in to Marco's demands. Alessandra felt a surge of relief. It was a strange, unexpected emotion. She should be hoping for her release, for a return to her family. But the thought of going back to Marco, to her old life, filled her with a sense of dread. So what happens now? She asked. Dario reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. I don't know, he said, his voice softening. But I swear to you, Alessandra, I will not let him have you. I will not let you go back to that life. He kissed her then, a kiss filled with a fierce possessiveness, a kiss that spoke of his determination to protect her, no matter the cost. The weight of the unspoken words, the unspoken threats, the unspoken desires, hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother their fragile hope. But in that kiss, in that moment, they found a refuge, a strength, a shared defiance that defied the darkness surrounding them. The locket, warm against her skin, was a tangible reminder of the love that bound them, a love that was becoming stronger, more resilient, with each passing day. Chapter 9. A glimmer of hope in the abyss. The stalemate continued. Don Giovanni refused Marco's demands, and Marco, in turn, refused to negotiate. Alessandra remained a captive, caught in the middle of a power struggle that had little to do with her and everything to do with the long-standing animosity between the two families. Dario was torn between his loyalty to his father and his love for Alessandra. He was walking a tightrope, trying to find a way to resolve the situation without sacrificing either. He spent hours poring over documents, searching for a loophole, a weakness, anything that could give him an advantage. One evening, he came to Alessandra's room with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I may have found something, he said, his voice filled with a cautious optimism. A legal technicality. A way to challenge Marco's claim. Alessandra listened intently as he explained his plan. It was complicated, risky, and involved uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. It hinged on proving that Marco's claim to the territories in question was based on fraudulent documents that had been forged by his father many years ago. It's a long shot, Dario admitted. But it's the only chance we have. Alessandra saw the determination in his eyes, the unwavering commitment to finding a solution. She knew that he was doing this for them. What can I do? She asked, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. Dario smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. You can help me. You know your family history. You know the secrets. You can guide me. Alessandra nodded. She was ready to fight, to do whatever it took to break free from the chains that bound her, both literally and figuratively. Over the next few days, they worked together, poring over old family records, searching for any clue that could help them. Alessandra shared her memories, her insights, her knowledge of the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that made up her family's history. She remembered whispered conversations overheard as a child, hushed discussions about business dealings, veiled threats, and secret agreements. She remembered the names of people, places, events that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on a new meaning. She discovered that her own grandfather, her father's father, had been involved in a shady deal with Marco's father, a deal that had involved the very territories that were now at the center of the dispute. She found evidence of forged documents, hidden transactions, and a long-standing pattern of deceit. As they uncovered the truth, Alessandra felt a sense of liberation. She was no longer a passive observer, a silent victim. She was an active participant, a key player in the fight for her own freedom. One evening, while they were working late into the night, Dario reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you, Alessandra," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. For trusting me. For helping me." She looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the exhaustion in his gaze, but she also saw the unwavering determination, the love that shone through. "I trust you, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "With my life." He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her. "And I will not let you down," he said. "I promise you." They had found a glimmer of hope in the abyss, a chance to break free from the past and forge a new future. But the path ahead was still fraught with danger, and the outcome remained uncertain. The whispers of the old house seemed to encourage them now, a chorus of hope rising above the shadows. Chapter 10. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Armed with the information Alessandra had unearthed, Dario presented his findings to his father. He hoped that Don Giovanni would see the logic in his plan, that he would recognize the opportunity to defeat Marco and secure the Luciano family's future. But Don Giovanni was a man of pride, a man of tradition, a man who refused to back down, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. He dismissed Dario's findings, accusing him of being blinded by his infatuation with Alessandra, of betraying his family's honor. "You are a Luciano," he roared, his face contorted with rage. "You will not negotiate with that snake, Marco. You will not give him an inch. You will crush him." Dario tried to reason with him, to explain that his plan was not about negotiation, but about exposing Marco's lies and securing their victory. But Don Giovanni was deaf to his pleas. He was blinded by his hatred for the Riccis, by his obsession with maintaining his power, by his refusal to admit that he might be wrong. The argument escalated, becoming more heated, more personal. Dario, for the first time in his life, openly defied his father, accusing him of being reckless, of jeopardizing their family's future for the sake of his own ego. Don Giovanni's response was swift and brutal. He struck Dario across the face, the force of the blow sending him sprawling to the floor. "You dare to question me?" he thundered. "You dare to defy me? You are my son, but you are also my subject. You will obey me, or you will suffer the consequences." Dario got to his feet, his cheeks stinging from the blow. He looked at his father, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and pity. "I am not your subject, father," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I am a man, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy everything we have built." He turned and walked away, leaving his father standing there, speechless with rage. He went straight to Alessandra's room, his heart pounding in his chest. When Alessandra saw his bruised face, her eyes filled with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dario told her everything, his voice raw with emotion. He recounted the argument with his father, his defiance, his father's brutal response. Alessandra listened, her heart aching for him. She knew how much he loved his father, how much he craved his approval. She also knew how difficult it was to stand up to a man like Don Giovanni, a man who ruled his family with an iron fist. "I'm so sorry, Dario," she said, her voice filled with compassion. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. "It's not your fault," he said. It's my father's. He's lost. He's consumed by his hatred." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice filled with despair.
I'm trapped.
I can't betray my father. But I can't let him destroy us." Alessandra took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You are not alone, Dario," she said. "We will face this together." She knew that they were facing an impossible situation. Dario was caught between his loyalty to his family and his love for her. And she was caught in the middle, a pawn in a deadly game that she had no control over. But in that moment, in the shared despair, they found a strength, a resolve, that they hadn't known they possessed. They were bound together by a love that had blossomed in the darkness, a love that defied the odds, a love that was worth fighting for. The betrayal by his father, however, cut deeper than any physical wound. It was a wound that threatened to shatter Dario's world, and Alessandra's along with it. The whispers in the hallway seemed to echo Don Giovanni's rage, a constant reminder of the impossible choice Dario faced. Chapter 11. Masks and Mirrors. The rift between Dario and his father cast a long shadow over the Luciano estate. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Dario avoided his father, spending most of his time in Alessandra's room, seeking solace in her presence, in her unwavering support. Alessandra, in turn, tried to be a source of strength for him, a calming influence in the midst of the storm. She listened to his frustrations, his fears, his doubts. She offered him comfort, understanding, and a perspective that he couldn't find anywhere else. She also began to notice the subtle changes in the household, the whispers, the glances, the veiled conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she approached. She realized that she was being watched, scrutinized, judged. She was an outsider, an enemy, a threat to the established order. One evening, Rosa, the elderly woman who brought her meals, finally spoke to her. She entered the room, her eyes darting nervously around, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Signora Ricci," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You must be careful. There are eyes everywhere." Alessandra looked at her, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked. Rosa hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There are those who do not approve, who believe you are a danger to the family." Alessandra understood. She was a threat to Don Giovanni's authority, a symbol of Dario's defiance. And there were those within the family who would do anything to eliminate that threat. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rosa shook her head. "I cannot say. But be warned. Trust no one." She left, leaving Alessandra alone with her fears, with the growing realization that she was surrounded by enemies, both seen and unseen. Later that night, Dario came to her room, his face pale, his expression grim. "I have news," he said, his voice heavy with dread. "My father, he has made a decision." Alessandra's blood ran cold. What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dario looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "He has agreed to a meeting with Marco." Alessandra felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She had hoped, against all odds, that Dario's plan would work, that they could find a way out of this situation. But now, it seemed, her fate was sealed. What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Dario reached out, his hand taking hers. "It means he is going to negotiate. He is going to trade you for what he wants." He could barely look her in the eyes. Shame and anger warred within him. Alessandra felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of acceptance. She had known, deep down, that this was inevitable. She was a pawn, a bargaining chip, and her value had just been determined. She looked directly into Dario's ashamed face. "When?" she asked, her voice steady. Dario swallowed hard. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow at dawn." He looked as though he might shatter. The masks they had both worn, the masks of hope, of defiance, of control, had finally shattered, revealing the harsh reality of their situation. They were trapped in a game of power, a game where they had no control over the outcome. The mirrors of the old house seemed to reflect their despair, their helplessness, their impending separation. The whispers had become a chorus of doom, a premonition of the heartbreak that awaited them. Chapter 12. The Unraveling Threads of Fate. The news of the impending meeting with Marco sent a wave of despair through Alessandra. The fragile hope that she and Dario had clung to, the dream of a future together, seemed to crumble before her eyes. She was to be returned to her husband, a man she barely knew, a man who saw her as nothing more than a possession. Dario was devastated. He had failed to protect her, failed to defy his father, failed to find a way out of the trap that had ensnared them. He paced restlessly in her room, his hands clenched into fists, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, guilt, and despair. "I won't let him do this," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I won't let him trade you. Like cattle." Alessandra reached out, her hand touching his arm.
"Dario," she said softly.
It's not your fault. You did everything you could." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers.
"No," he said.
I should have done more. I should have found another way." He looked at her, his gaze filled with a desperate longing. I can't lose you, Alessandra," he whispered. I love you." The words, spoken with such raw emotion, such vulnerability, sent a shiver down her spine. She had known, of course, that he cared for her, but to hear him say the words, to hear him confess his love, was overwhelming. "I love you too, Dario," she said, her voice trembling. More than I ever thought possible." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. They clung to each other, their bodies trembling, their hearts aching with the knowledge that their time together was running out. They spent the night together, talking, holding each other, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They made love, a desperate, passionate act of defiance, a way of clinging to each other, of defying the fate that awaited them. As dawn approached, a sense of dread settled over them. They knew that this was their last few hours, their last moments of freedom, of connection, of love. Dario dressed, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I don't know what to say," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Alessandra reached out, her hand cupping his cheek. There's nothing to say," she said softly. We knew this was inevitable." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tender kiss, a farewell kiss, a kiss filled with all the unspoken words, all the unfulfilled dreams, all the love that they had shared. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. At the door, he paused, looking back at her. "I will never forget you, Alessandra," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Never." Then he was gone. Alessandra stood there, alone in the room, her heart breaking. She watched from the window as he walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the estate. The threads of fate, the threads that had bound them together, had finally unraveled, leaving her alone, adrift, facing an uncertain future. The whispers of the house seemed to mourn with her, a lament for a love that had been lost before it had truly begun. She clutched the locket around her neck, the only tangible reminder of the man she loved, the man she had lost. Chapter 13. A Pact Forged in Darkness. Alessandra was escorted from her room by two of Don Giovanni's men, their faces grim, their expressions unreadable. She was taken to the main hall of the estate, where a tense scene awaited her. Don Giovanni stood at the head of a long table, his face a mask of cold fury. Marco, her husband, stood opposite him, his expression smug, his eyes filled with a predatory gleam. Dario was nowhere to be seen. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken threats and simmering animosity. Alessandra felt like a pawn in a chess game, a piece to be moved and sacrificed at the whim of the players. Marco approached her, his eyes raking over her with a possessive gaze. "Alessandra," he said, his voice smooth, oily. "It's good to have you back." She recoiled from his touch, her skin crawling. She looked at him, her eyes filled with disgust. "I am not yours to have," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. Marco chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You're my wife," he said. "You belong to me, by law and by tradition." Don Giovanni slammed his fist on the table, the force of the blow making Alessandra jump. "Enough," he thundered. "Let us conclude this business." The negotiations began, a tense back and forth between the two men, a discussion about territories, about power, about money. Alessandra was treated as an object, a commodity to be traded, her feelings, her desires, completely disregarded. She felt a surge of anger, of rebellion. She had been silent for too long, obedient for too long, a pawn in the games of men. She would not be silent anymore. "I have a condition," she said, her voice clear and strong. Both men looked at her, surprised by her sudden interjection. "What is it?" Don Giovanni asked, his voice laced with annoyance. Alessandra looked directly at Marco, her eyes blazing with defiance.
"I will return to you," she said.
"But only if you agree to release the prisoners, the men you captured during the raid." This was a complete fabrication, a shot in the dark, a desperate attempt to exert some control. Marco laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "You are in no position to make demands, Alessandra," he said. "She is right," a voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dario standing there, his face pale but determined. He had defied his father, defied the expectations of his family, to stand by Alessandra's side. "The prisoners are innocent," Dario said, his voice firm. "They have nothing to do with this feud. Release them and Alessandra will return to her husband." He could hardly bear to say the words. Don Giovanni glared at his son, his face contorted with rage. "You dare to interfere?"
he roared.
Dario stood his ground, his eyes locked with his father's. "I am doing what is right," he said. A tense silence filled the room. Marco, seeing an opportunity to exploit the rift between father and son, smirked. "Very well," he said. "I agree. Release the prisoners and Alessandra is mine." He knew no prisoners had been taken. He was playing along, enjoying the chaos he was causing. Don Giovanni, his authority challenged, his plans disrupted, hesitated. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else. Something that might have been respect. "So be it," he said, his voice grudging. "The prisoners will be released." A pact had been forged, a pact born of defiance, of love, of a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of honor in the midst of a brutal power struggle. Alessandra had spoken, Dario had acted, and the fate of non-existent prisoners had been decided. But the true cost of this pact, the true consequences of their actions, remained to be seen. The whispers in the hall seemed to shift, from a chorus of doom to a murmur of uncertainty, a reflection of the volatile situation that had just unfolded. Chapter 14. Revelations under the moonlit sky. With the agreement made, a strange, uneasy calm settled over the estate. Marco, satisfied with his victory, departed, leaving Alessandra with the Lucianos for one final night. The release of the prisoners was a fiction, a fabrication that had served its purpose, but the tension it had created lingered in the air. Dario was ostracized by his father, treated as a traitor, a pariah. He was confined to his quarters, forbidden from seeing Alessandra. But he defied his father's orders, sneaking to her room under the cover of darkness. He found her sitting by the window, gazing at the moonlit sky. She looked pale, fragile, but her eyes still held that spark of defiance, that unwavering spirit that had drawn him to her. "Alessandra," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. She turned to him, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Dario," she said softly. You came." He rushed to her side, taking her hands in his. I couldn't stay away," he said. "I had to see you. One last time." They sat together in silence, their hands clasped, their shoulders touching. The moon cast a soft glow over the room, illuminating their faces, their expressions a mixture of sadness, regret, and love. I don't understand," Alessandra said, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you do it? Why did you defy your father? For a lie? Dario looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound tenderness. It wasn't a lie, Alessandra, he said. It was a test of loyalty, of honor, of love. He explained that he had suspected, for some time, that there was a traitor within his family, someone who was secretly working with Marco, someone who was feeding him information, someone who was undermining the Lucianos from within. The prisoners had been a way to expose that traitor, to force them to reveal their hand. And it had worked. Who? Alessandra asked, her voice filled with a growing sense of unease. Dario hesitated, then took a deep breath. It was my uncle. Ricardo, he said, his voice heavy with disbelief and betrayal. My father's brother. Alessandra gasped. Ricardo Luciano was a powerful figure within the family, a man who had always been seen as loyal, trustworthy, a pillar of the Luciano empire. Dario explained that Ricardo had been secretly resentful of his brother's power, that he had been plotting for years to overthrow him, to take control of the family. Marco had been his pawn, his instrument in this treacherous game.
My father, he doesn't know, Dario said.
I haven't told him.
Yet.
He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a plea for understanding. I needed to be sure, he said. I needed proof. And you gave it to me. Alessandra realized that her impulsive demand, her fabricated condition, had inadvertently uncovered a deeper, darker truth. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that threatened to tear the Luciano family apart. What will you do?
She asked.
Dario looked at her, his expression resolute. I will expose him, he said. I will reveal the truth. To my father. To the family. He knew that this would be a dangerous move, that it would unleash a storm of conflict and betrayal within the Luciano family. But he was determined to do what was right, to protect his family, to honor his love for Alessandra. The revelations under the moonlit sky had changed everything. The pact that had been forged in darkness had revealed a deeper darkness, a hidden treachery that threatened to consume them all. But it had also revealed a strength, a resilience, a bond between Dario and Alessandra that could not be broken. The whispers seemed to hold their breath, anticipating the storm that was about to break. Chapter 15. The Heart's Silent Rebellion. The following morning, Alessandra prepared to leave the Luciano estate. She dressed in the clothes she had arrived in, the silk dress now feeling foreign, a relic of a life she no longer recognized. She clutched the locket Dario had given her, the cool metal a constant reminder of his love, of his promise, of the uncertain future that awaited them. Rosa, the elderly servant, entered the room, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something that looked like hope. Signora Ricci, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I have a message. For you. Alessandra looked at her, her heart pounding in her chest. From whom? She asked. Rosa hesitated, then took a deep breath. From Don Giovanni, she said. Alessandra was stunned. Don Giovanni, the man who had orchestrated her kidnapping, the man who had treated her as a pawn, the man who had disowned his own son for her sake, wanted to speak to her?
He awaits you, Rosa said.
In the garden. Alessandra followed Rosa to the neglected garden, the same garden she had gazed upon from her window, the garden that had become a symbol of her captivity, of her isolation, of her unexpected transformation. Don Giovanni stood amidst the overgrown roses, his back to her. He was an imposing figure, even in his advanced age, his presence radiating power and authority. Alessandra approached him cautiously, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. You wish to speak to me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Don Giovanni turned to face her, his eyes, the same intense brown as his son's, studying her with a piercing gaze. He looked older, wearier, his face etched with the lines of a life lived on the edge, a life filled with conflict and betrayal. You are a remarkable woman, Alessandra Ricci, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. You have courage. You have spirit. You have loyalty. Alessandra was taken aback by his words. She had expected anger, hostility, perhaps even threats. But she saw something else in his eyes, something that looked like respect. "My son, he loves you," Don Giovanni said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He has defied me for you. He has risked everything for you." He paused, his gaze shifting to the overgrown roses, a faraway look in his eyes. I have been a fool," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have been blinded by hatred, by tradition, by pride." He looked back at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "My brother Ricardo, he betrayed me," he said. He plotted against me. He used Marco to destroy me." He told her everything, confirming Dario's suspicions, revealing the depth of Ricardo's treachery, the extent of his betrayal. Alessandra listened, her heart aching for the old man, for the pain he had endured, for the mistakes he had made. "My son, he saved me," Don Giovanni said. He exposed Ricardo. He protected the family." He looked at Alessandra, his eyes searching hers. "I owe you an apology," he said. "And I owe you my gratitude." He reached out, his hand taking hers. His touch, surprisingly gentle, sent a shiver down her spine. You have shown me the error of my ways," he said. "You have shown me the power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption." He released her hand, his gaze shifting to the rising sun, the sky painted with streaks of pink and gold. "Go," he said, his voice firm. "Go and be with my son. You have my blessing." Alessandra was speechless. She had expected to leave the Luciano estate as a captive, a pawn, a victim. But she was leaving as a free woman, a woman who had earned the respect of her captor, a woman who had found love in the most unexpected of places. The heart's silent rebellion, her own and Dario's, had changed everything. The whispers of the garden seemed to sing a song of hope, of new beginnings, of a future filled with possibilities. Chapter 16. Crossroads of Love and Duty. Don Giovanni's unexpected blessing left Alessandra in a state of stunned disbelief. She had gone from captive to cherished, from pawn to pivotal player, in a transformation that defied all logic and expectation. She returned to her room, her mind reeling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy, relief, and uncertainty. Dario was waiting for her, his face etched with worry. He had heard the rumors, the whispers of his father's meeting with Alessandra, and he feared the worst. "What happened?" he asked, his voice urgent. "What did he say?" Alessandra looked at him, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "He gave us his blessing," she said, her voice trembling. Dario stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and elation. He what?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alessandra repeated her words, recounting her conversation with Don Giovanni, his confession, his apology, his unexpected change of heart. Dario was overwhelmed. He had expected condemnation, punishment, perhaps even banishment. But his father, the man he had defied, the man he had feared, had finally seen the truth, had finally recognized the power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption. He pulled Alessandra into his arms, holding her close, his body trembling with emotion. I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I thought I had lost you." "You will never lose me, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "Never." They stood there for a long moment, embracing, their hearts overflowing with a love that had survived betrayal, captivity, and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles of their family's feud. But even in this moment of joy, a shadow of uncertainty lingered. Alessandra was still legally married to Marco, still bound by the traditions and expectations of her former life. And Dario was still the heir to the Luciano Empire, still burdened by the responsibilities and obligations of his family. What do we do now?" Alessandra asked, her voice filled with a hesitant hope. Dario looked at her, his eyes searching hers. We face the future," he said. "Together." He knew that their path would not be easy, that they would face challenges, obstacles, perhaps even opposition from within their families. But he was determined to build a life with Alessandra, a life based on love, on trust, on respect. He proposed a plan. He would formally renounce his claim to the Luciano leadership, stepping aside to allow his younger cousin, a man of peace and reason, to take over. He would leave the world of the Mafia, the world of violence and betrayal, behind. Alessandra, in turn, would seek an annulment of her marriage to Marco, a process that would be difficult, complicated, and perhaps even dangerous. But she was determined to break free from the chains of her past, to embrace a future with Dario. They were at a crossroads, a point where love and duty collided, where tradition and freedom clashed. They had chosen love, chosen freedom, chosen to forge their own path, a path that would be fraught with challenges, but also filled with the promise of a life lived on their own terms. The whispers of the house seemed to support their decision, a chorus of encouragement urging them forward on their uncertain journey. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm. Dario's decision to renounce his claim and Alessandra's pursuit of an annulment sent ripples of shock and disbelief through both families. The Riccis, particularly Marco, were enraged. The annulment was a public humiliation, a challenge to his authority, a threat to his carefully constructed image. He vowed revenge, promising to make Alessandra pay for her defiance. The Lucianos were divided. Some, particularly the older generation, were appalled by Dario's decision, seeing it as a betrayal of family tradition, a sign of weakness. Others, particularly the younger generation, saw it as a courageous act, a step towards a more peaceful, more prosperous future. Don Giovanni, surprisingly, supported his son's decision. He had been changed by the events of the past few weeks, transformed by Alessandra's influence, by his son's unwavering love, by his own near-fatal mistake. He had realized that the old ways, the ways of violence and vengeance, were no longer sustainable. He publicly endorsed Dario's decision, announcing his retirement and naming his younger cousin, Alessandro, as his successor. He also offered his protection to Alessandra, vowing to shield her from Marco's wrath. But Marco was not easily deterred. He had powerful allies, connections within the legal system, and a network of informants who kept him abreast of every development. He began to orchestrate a campaign of intimidation, using his influence to delay the annulment proceedings, to harass Alessandra's lawyers, to spread rumors and lies about her character. Alessandra, despite the danger, remained resolute. She was determined to break free from Marco, to build a life with Dario, to escape the suffocating confines of her past. She found strength in Dario's love, in Don Giovanni's unexpected support, and in her own growing sense of self-worth. One evening, while Dario and Alessandra were meeting secretly in a small, secluded trattoria in Rome, they were ambushed. Armed men, their faces masked, surrounded them, their weapons drawn. "Marco sends his regards," one of the men said, his voice cold, menacing. Dario reacted instantly, shielding Alessandra with his body. He was unarmed, having left his weapon behind in an attempt to distance himself from his former life. But he was a trained fighter, a man who had grown up in a world of violence, a man who would do anything to protect the woman he loved. A brutal fight ensued, a chaotic melee of fists, knives, and gunshots. Dario fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his movements swift, precise, deadly. Alessandra, despite her fear, did not cower. She picked up a chair, using it as a weapon, striking one of the attackers, giving Dario a precious few seconds to gain the upper hand. They managed to fight off the attackers, escaping into the narrow, winding streets of Rome, their hearts pounding, their bodies bruised and battered. They knew that this was just the beginning, that Marco would not stop until he had achieved his revenge. The storm was gathering, the forces of darkness aligning against them. But they were not alone. They had each other, they had Don Giovanni's support, and they had a growing network of allies who believed in their cause, who believed in a future free from the violence and tyranny of the past. The whispers of the city seemed to warn them, a chorus of impending danger, but also a murmur of hope, of resilience, of the unwavering power of love. Chapter 18. Flames of Resistance. The attack in Rome was a wake-up call. Dario and Alessandra realized that they were not safe, that Marco's reach extended far beyond the confines of their families, that he was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his revenge. They went into hiding, moving from one safe house to another, relying on the support of Don Giovanni and a growing network of allies who believed in their cause. They were fugitives, hunted by Marco's men, constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. But they were not passive victims. They were determined to fight back, to expose Marco's crimes, to bring him to justice, to clear their names and build a future together. Dario, using his knowledge of the underworld, began to gather evidence against Marco, uncovering his illegal activities, his corrupt connections, his history of violence and intimidation. He worked with Alessandro, the new head of the Luciano family, to dismantle Marco's network of influence, to disrupt his operations, to weaken his power base. Alessandra, using her intelligence and her newfound courage, began to reach out to other women who had been victimized by Marco, women who had been silenced by fear, women who had been trapped in abusive relationships, women who were ready to speak out. She found strength in their stories, in their shared experience of oppression, in their collective desire for justice. She became a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced, a beacon of resistance against the tyranny of men like Marco. One by one, women began to come forward, sharing their stories, providing evidence, risking their lives to expose Marco's crimes. The tide began to turn. The media, initially hesitant to challenge a man of Marco's power and influence, began to report on the allegations, on the growing chorus of accusations, on the evidence of his widespread corruption. Marco, realizing that he was losing control, became increasingly desperate. He ordered his men to intensify their efforts to find Dario and Alessandra, to silence them permanently. He threatened, bribed, and intimidated anyone who stood in his way. But it was too late. The flames of resistance had been ignited, and they were spreading rapidly, consuming everything in their path. The truth was out, and it could not be contained. One evening, while Dario and Alessandra were hiding in a small, remote village in the Tuscan countryside, they received word that Marco had been arrested. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the accusations too numerous to ignore, the public outcry too loud to silence. They were overjoyed, relieved, but also cautious. They knew that Marco still had powerful allies, that he would not go down without a fight. But they also knew that they had won a major victory, that they had taken a significant step towards achieving their freedom, towards building a future together. The whispers of the countryside seemed to celebrate their victory, a chorus of hope, of resilience, of the triumph of good over evil. Chapter 19. A Reckoning of Souls. Marco's arrest was a turning point, but it was not the end. He still had powerful allies, connections within the legal system, and a vast fortune that he could use to influence the outcome of his trial. He hired the best lawyers, launched a smear campaign against Alessandra and Dario, and attempted to bribe witnesses and judges. But the tide had turned. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the accusations too numerous to ignore, and the public outcry too loud to silence. The women Alessandra had helped to empower stood firm, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to be silenced. They testified against him, sharing their stories of abuse, of violence, of oppression. Dario, using his knowledge of the underworld and his newfound alliance with Alessandro, provided crucial evidence that exposed Marco's criminal activities, his corrupt connections, and his long history of violence and intimidation. Don Giovanni, despite his declining health, testified against Marco, revealing his own past mistakes, acknowledging his complicity in the feud, and publicly denouncing his former ally. The trial was a media sensation, a public reckoning of souls, a battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. Alessandra and Dario, despite the danger, attended the trial every day, sitting in the front row, their hands clasped, their eyes fixed on Marco, their presence a constant reminder of his crimes, of his victims, of the justice that was finally being served. Marco, throughout the trial, maintained his innocence, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy, a vendetta orchestrated by Alessandra, Dario, and the Lucianos. He portrayed himself as a wronged husband, a betrayed ally, a man of honor who had been falsely accused. But his lies were exposed, his defenses crumbled, his carefully constructed facade shattered. The jury, after weeks of testimony, after reviewing mountains of evidence, after hearing the heartbreaking stories of his victims, reached a verdict: guilty. Marco was sentenced to a long prison term, his empire crumbling around him, his power broken, his reputation destroyed. He was led away in handcuffs, his face contorted with rage and disbelief, his eyes filled with a hatred that would consume him for the rest of his days. Alessandra and Dario embraced, tears streaming down their faces, their bodies trembling with relief and exhaustion. They had won. They had faced the storm, had endured the trials, had overcome the obstacles, and had emerged victorious. But the victory was bittersweet. They had lost much along the way. They had been forced to confront their pasts, to relive their traumas, to expose their vulnerabilities. They had been hunted, threatened, attacked. They had seen the darkness that lurked within the human soul, the depths of depravity, the capacity for cruelty. But they had also found strength, resilience, and a love that had defied all odds. They had discovered the power of forgiveness, of redemption, of healing. They had learned that even in the darkest of times, hope can survive, that even in the most broken of souls, love can blossom. The courtroom, silent for a moment, felt like the whole world was acknowledging a battle fought and won, not with weapons, but with truth and courage. Chapter 20. Redemption's Embrace. With Marco's conviction and imprisonment, Alessandra and Dario were finally free. Free from fear, free from the past, free to build a future together. Alessandra's annulment was granted swiftly, the legal ties that had bound her to Marco severed forever. They left Rome, leaving behind the world of the Mafia, the world of violence and betrayal, the world that had shaped them, scarred them, but ultimately had brought them together. They moved to a small, secluded villa in Tuscany, the same villa where they had hidden during the final days of their struggle, the villa that had become a symbol of their resilience, of their hope, of their love. They spent their days tending to the garden, reading, talking, walking hand in hand through the rolling hills, savoring the simple pleasures of life, the quiet moments of peace and contentment that they had never known before. They healed, slowly, gradually, their wounds, both physical and emotional, beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of serenity, of wholeness, of belonging. Dario, true to his word, renounced his claim to the Luciano leadership, embracing a life of quiet anonymity, a life dedicated to Alessandra, to their love, to their shared future. He found peace in working the land, in creating beauty, in nurturing life, a stark contrast to the world of violence and destruction he had left behind. Alessandra, freed from the shackles of her past, blossomed. She rediscovered her passions, her talents, her dreams. She painted, she wrote, she embraced the beauty of the world around her, finding solace in nature, in art, in the simple act of living. She also became an advocate for women's rights, using her experience, her voice, her newfound platform to help other women escape abusive relationships, to find their strength, to reclaim their lives. Don Giovanni, his health failing, visited them often, spending his final days in the peace and tranquility of their villa, surrounded by the love of his son and the woman who had changed his life, the woman who had shown him the error of his ways, the woman who had led him to redemption. He died peacefully. In his sleep, his hand clasped in Dario's, a faint smile on his lips, his soul finally at rest, his legacy transformed from one of violence and vengeance to one of peace and forgiveness. Alessandra and Dario, years later, stood hand in hand in their garden, watching the sunset paint the Tuscan sky with vibrant hues of orange, pink, and gold. They were older, wiser, their faces etched with the lines of a life lived fully, a life filled with challenges, with triumphs, with a love that had endured the test of time. They had found their redemption, their peace, their happiness, not in the grand palaces of Rome, not in the power and prestige of their families, but in the simple beauty of the Tuscan countryside, in the quiet moments of shared love, in the embrace of a future they had built together, a future free from the shadows of the past. The whispers of the villa were now a gentle lullaby, a song of love, of peace, of redemption's enduring embrace. Epilogue. Years melted into decades. The Tuscan sun, which had once witnessed their desperate flight, now warmed their aging faces, faces etched with the stories of a life lived fully, a life carved from the heart of adversity. Alessandra and Dario, their hands still intertwined, walked through their garden, a vibrant tapestry of colors and scents, a testament to their enduring love, a sanctuary built on the ruins of their past. The villa, once a refuge from danger, had become a home, filled with the echoes of laughter, the whispers of shared secrets, the quiet comfort of companionship. The scars of their past, both visible and hidden, had faded, transformed into badges of honor, reminders of the battles they had fought, the victories they had won, the love that had sustained them. Dario, his hair now silvered, his movements slower, still looked at Alessandra with the same unwavering adoration, the same profound tenderness that had captured her heart so many years ago. He had found peace in the simplicity of their life, in the rhythm of the seasons, in the beauty of the natural world, a world far removed from the violence and betrayal of his youth. Alessandra, her beauty undiminished by time, her spirit still vibrant, returned his gaze with a love that had deepened, matured, become the very essence of her being. She had blossomed in her freedom, her creativity flourishing, her voice resonating with the strength and wisdom gained from her experiences. She had become a beacon of hope for other women, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a living embodiment of the power of love to conquer even the darkest of shadows. Their children, and later their grandchildren, filled the villa with life, with laughter, with the promise of a future free from the feuds, the violence, the suffocations of the past. They had created a legacy of love, of forgiveness, of redemption, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Tuscan sky with a breathtaking panorama of colors, Dario and Alessandra sat on their terrace, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with a profound sense of gratitude, of peace, of completion. Dario, his voice raspy with age, whispered, "We did it, Alessandra. We found our way." Alessandra, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears, smiled. "Yes, my love," she whispered back. "We did." Together. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge one by one, illuminating the night sky, their light a reflection of the enduring love that had guided them through darkness, a love that had transformed their lives, a love that had redeemed their souls. The whispers of the villa, carried on the gentle breeze, were a lullaby of peace, of contentment, of a love story that had defied all odds, a love story that would live on, forever etched in the heart of the Tuscan countryside.